exactly what we have in the European Union, because this has been an ongoing construction for decades. People died in the making of this European Union, particularly in
willpower, fuelled by packets of Haribo and sealed following a visit to the chip shop. We found an agreement that enshrines the United Kingdom's special status as a country never joining the Euro and never joining Schengen. As a country that does not wish to be part of
it is the British people who are deciding, and that the British politicians are taking position. And I can tell you one thing, if there is one party in the UK who's going to fight that Britain remain in the Union, it's going to be the Liberal Democratic movement, and them alone.
To its laws, future generations, a generation of the British decided to join the European Union. That generation can now not impose on European institutions.
The new settlement promised to us in 2013 by David Cameron has been ditched. Our sovereignty will continue to be eroded and our security will continue to be at risk. We will continue to send billions more to the EU than we get back, and the fundamental flaws of membership will remain. But Mr. President, even if we look at the mediocre tweaks being hailed by those advocating Remain, they bring with them no guarantees. There will be...
Once you have said no in the referendum, you are invited back to the negotiation table, like with Ireland, like with Denmark, like after the constitution with France and the Netherlands. But it's not about the same thing. That was about the constitution, that was about a treaty. Here it's about in or out. It's the one or the other. And if I see how the currency of Britain is endangered,
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnott wanted to ask a question. Do you agree?
None of the fear tactics or scaremongering that we've seen from Mr. Hofstadt, so thank you. I think you're giving the EU a lot of credit for things that it hasn't done, but you mentioned the deal, and look, in my view, the deal, we've got rid of the words ever closer union, which never had legal force, and we've got this emergency brake that's not clear how it's going to be applied and misunderstands the problem. So my question to you is, can you think of any other concrete example of anything that Cameron's actually achieved in this deal?
No, but sorry, you mentioned what was the most urgent idea, yeah, this break, and this emergency break, it's in. And I can tell you, so I'm always open to compromise. Europe is always about compromise. Everything we move by compromise. But in the long run, I will never agree that, for example, workers coming from the Eastern European states are seen as second-class workers. And I hope that you agree with me on this.
Vielen Dank. Das Wort für die Thank you very much. Now for the EFDD group, Mr. Farage.
Really rather exciting, isn't it? It's referendum season, and the referendum is coming on the 6th of April in the Netherlands, where they're going to have a referendum on the Ukrainian deal, and the opinion polls show they are going to reject it. And just today, Mr. Orban has announced there is going to be a referendum in Hungary, where they're going to have a referendum on whether they should be forced to accept mandatory quotas for migrants after the grievous errors of the EU's common asylum policy, not to mention Mrs. Merkel's pronouncements. And overnight we get a Czech Premier telling us that there is now demand building in the Czech Republic to have a referendum on membership. Oh, and I nearly forgot, there's going to be a British referendum on June the 23rd on whether we remain or leave the European Union. And this follows a 40-hour summit where Mr. Cameron, doing his modern-day impression of Oliver Twist, went up to Mr. Tusk and said, "Please, sir, can I have some more concessions?" Well, he didn't get very much, did he? We're allowed to change ever so slightly migrant benefits for a short period of time, and we're told that in future we won't be committed to ever closer union. And on the basis of all of that, we're going to have a referendum that the Prime Minister says on a deal that is legally binding. And indeed, Mr Tusk joined in with this today by saying the British deal was legally binding. To top that off, Mr Cameron has told us that he will lodge the deal, he will lodge the documents at the United Nations. But frankly, you might as well lodge an old pair of socks, because it's completely meaningless. The fact that you lodge a document there, you could use a safety deposit box. But is this deal legally binding, Mr Tusk? Well, the ECJ themselves said in 2008 that the obligations imposed by an international agreement cannot have the effect of prejudicing the constitutional principles of the EU treaties, which means the ECJ rule in favour of the existing treaties until we get a new treaty. But who's to say there's going to be a new treaty? Any new treaty would trigger yet more referendums and would not be favoured, I think, by the big groups in this Parliament. But of course we have an emergency brake. That's being judged to be a great success. But, crucially, that happens through secondary legislation that can be voted on by this Parliament. So what happens? We have a referendum, we follow Mr Cameron, we vote to remain, and then we come back to this Parliament. Is this Parliament going to support British exceptionalism? And I think we've heard voices today that make it perfectly clear that that will not happen. So the deal, Mr Tusk, and Mr Cameron, if you're listening, is not legally binding in any way at all. And I have to say the British public will decide which is our safest option. Is it safe to stay within an organisation whose own police boss tells us there are 3,000 to 5,000 terrorists that have now come into our continent through the migrant crisis, or is it safest to take back control of our own borders and our own democracy? After much consideration, I have decided to opt to vote for us to leave.
Herr Farage, es gibt eine...
Thank you, Mr Farage. There is a question from Mr Casa. Do you want to... will you accept that? Mr Casa, please.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Well, we all know that Mr Farage has been working for Britain to leave since I joined here in Parliament 11 years ago. He has tried local elections in the United Kingdom, but he didn't have any success, did he? Then he went for the general elections in the United Kingdom, hardly a success there. On the contrary, he secured a bigger majority for David Cameron and the Conservative Party. Now, if in the referendum, which he always wanted, the majority of the British people say yes, meaning to stay part of us in the European Union, will he call it a day and retire from politics? Or would he want another chance to stay here, enjoying the company of us Europeans?
Well, Mr Casa, I don't know who's been briefing you on UKIP's electoral history. You perhaps haven't got a very good memory, I'm not sure. But in 2014, with 28% of the vote, UKIP won the European elections, topping the poll across the United Kingdom, the first time since 1906 that a party that wasn't Labour or the Conservatives had won a national election. So I hope that brings you up to speed. As for the referendum, yeah, I believe it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm certain that if we vote to remain, we're unlikely ever to get another opportunity, and we will sink deeper inside this political union. But I think there's every chance now that the momentum is on our side of the argument, and so yes, we're going to vote to leave, and within a short period of time, all the British MEPs will be gone. How about that?
Für die ENF-Fraktion.
Thank you. For the ENF group now, Madame Le Pen. Careful with the predicting the results, the analyses of respective countries. I think that the Socialists went down to 22% in last elections and no one resigned that I can remember. Honourable members, 4 months' time, the UK will vote, the Britons will vote in or out, and it's for the people to decide on a fundamental issue, and it's perfectly legitimate, and it shows the vitality of British democracy, unlike France. Not all the media are unanimously pro-European, and there will be a real democratic debate. There will be many ideas will be involved in the cut and thrust. Now, freedom of opinion and respect for all opinions, that goes to the heart of democracy. And Brexit is for the UK an opportunity to look back and measure the benefits of joining up. Way back in '76, if they decide that it's wanting, they can opt for freedom, for sovereignty, and if they do that, they'll find the ways of solving the problems of the modern world. Now, if you think back to Article 28 of the Charter of Human Rights, a generation cannot subjugate to its laws future generations. A generation of the British decided to join the European Union. That generation can now not impose on European institutions cannot impose our institutions to future generations, and that's a lesson of democracy, and it has full legitimacy. European Union imposes innumerable rules and treaties on successive generations, but decisions, those are taken by unelected people, usually without proper democratic debate and without it having even been had out in the media. That's the opposite of those who are ruled, and this is a kind of tyranny, arriving legally in power but then making an illegal and violent use of it. A travesty of an agreement is not going to change that cruel reality any more than threats or blackmail which are proliferating on the margins of the system, nor the polls taken by Mr. Soros used by Mr. Weber, who clearly prefers
Thank you, President. The deal struck last week was hard fought by all sides. Many countries had concerns and objections, but I am glad that those hurdles were overcome. Aided by willpower, fuelled by packets of Haribo, and sealed following a visit to the chip shop, we found an agreement that enshrines the United Kingdom's special status as a country never joining the euro and never joining Schengen, as a country that does not wish to be part of the ratchet of the European political project, that delivers a live and let live agreement, one where the United Kingdom continues to play an active role in the European Union, without facing discrimination in areas where it wishes to keep national control. The ECR group welcomes this deal, and now it is for the British people to pass judgment on these new terms. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be supporting the campaign to remain in the European Union. Easy, gentlemen. My reasoning is simple. Britain's economic recovery, though good, is still fragile, and I will not put it at risk by tearing us away from the single market. And I also believe that my constituents will be safer and my country more secure if we continue our cooperation with our European partners. There are good people who would disagree with me, and I respect their decision. And if the British people decide to leave, then we must respect that choice and make it work. But there are also those in this chamber who are not respectful of other people's choices. We can hear them jeering today behind me, those who compare the EU with the Soviet Union. I think that is foolish and offensive to those who actually lived under the yoke of communism. Because unlike the USSR, any country is free to leave the European Union. Mr Farage, that is the will of the sovereign people. Being in the EU is a choice, and the Conservative Party will respect that choice. So, Mr President, the voters in Britain will exercise their sovereignty. They will decide whether to remain or to leave. And in the UK, we can now look forward to debating this subject for the next 4 months. The EU must concentrate on the migration crisis it faces. The Dutch Prime Minister said we had 6 to 8 weeks to save Schengen. He said that 5 weeks ago. In this chamber, we seem unwilling to accept that the migrant crisis was exacerbated when Chancellor Merkel said Germany would take people without limits, unilaterally defying a number of European rules. And guess what? People are coming without limits. And when some countries, like Hungary, apply the rules and defend the Schengen border, they are criticised. And where other countries break the rules, they are applauded. We cannot begin to solve this crisis until we enforce the rules in place to protect the external Schengen border, to focus on the basics of processing, detention and returns, and to prevent asylum seekers and economic migrants moving around the EU at will. We need international action to end the conflict in Syria. We need to give priority to those refugees already in the camps in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, both with humanitarian aid and in offering them refuge. Is it not perverse that the EU gives priority to those who cross the Aegean rather than those already classified as refugees by the United Nations? Mr Tusk, I recommend that for the next EU summit you order in copious amounts of chips from Maison Antoine and you tell the EU leaders to get cracking.
Herr Fox, ich habe eine...
Mr Fox, there's a question for you from Mr Corbett.
Bitte, Herr Corbett.
Delighted to hear Mr Fox say that he's come off the fence in favour of campaigning to remain in the European Union. We all know that his party is split from head to toe on this question. May I ask him, among the 20 British Conservative MEPs, how many will be campaigning with your party leader, your Prime Minister, to remain in the European Union, and how many will be campaigning with UKIP to get Britain to walk out, slamming the door on all our neighbouring countries?
Bitte sehr.
Well, Mr President, I think if Mr Corbett is so interested in the opinions of my colleagues, he should ask them.
Okay. Das Wort hat jetzt für die...
Thank you very much. Next for the Liberal group, Mr Verhofstadt.
Nevertheless, it was an interesting question by Mr Corbett, and I think I can add something. Why Mr Kamal is not...
Herr Verhofstadt, warten Sie mal, Ihre Kollegin...
Mr Verhofstadt, Madame Goulard also had a question. Or is it a point of order, if I understand correctly? Madame Goulard.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Madam President. It seems to me that this is the European Parliament. And when you take blue cards, my blue card had been in the air for a while, you should look, it's one thing, it should be looking at the questions between British members and other members, rather than British questions, which can take place elsewhere. And I would like to put a question to Mr Fox, if that's possible.
Liebe Frau Goulard, wir haben die...
Thank you, Madam Goulard. The rule is that the blue cards are not attributed depending on nationality. Mr Corbett, it so happens, was the first up. And so far, I've always given the blue card question. First come, first served. Mr Campbell Bannerman had signalled before the Speaker spoke.
Natürlich stimmt das.
No, that is the case. How can you claim any difference, madam?
Bestätigen, Herr Präsident.
Well, colleagues behind me will have seen it. Well, they can see as well as you can, and it clearly was that Mr. Corbett had his hand up first. Had you had your hand up first, you would have been taken for the blue card. Now the chair of your group, Madam, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Going further on the question of Mr. Corbett and Mrs. Goulard, I'm simply wondering, Mr. Fox, why you are now speaking and not Mr. Kamal. I think he is still in doubt and he doesn't know for the moment what he is going to do. And that is a better answer, I think, to the question of Mr. Corbett than saying that they have to ask it themselves. But I have another issue. Involved in these negotiations from the beginning, Mr. Fox, I have asked it always myself why this British deal was so necessary and so vital. And I can tell you, from one thing I'm sure, this deal is not about Europe. And it is a deal to reunite, in fact, the Tory party. Let's be honest about this. And I may not know the result of the referendum, if Britain will remain in the Union, but I'm sure of one result, that is that it will not reunite the Tory party. That is for clear. Because what I'm seeing is a glorified cockfight since Mr. Tusk had reached this deal. Boris Johnson challenging David Cameron. I can tell you, I have seen an ambitious politician. I myself an ambitious politician, but Boris Johnson takes it to a whole other level. Other level because it's real the Mayor of London acting against the interests of the citizens of London. And that all for personal ambition and certainly not for a better Europe and for a better Britain. It's totally bonkers, dear colleagues. And it's pathetic, I should say, that it is happening. It's even dramatic for Britain, especially, Mr. Fox. The pound, what we see, is rapidly falling. The unity of the United Kingdom is under threat. And their American cousins are saying, please stop it. We will not make a trade deal with you outside the Union. This, apparently the special relationship between the US and the UK is apparently not so special anymore today. So let me give an advice to those who are doing this now, this debate in Britain. Don't think that after a no, you can come back to the negotiation table. I know that some people are thinking that, saying, it's Europe. Once you have said no in a referendum, you are invited back to the negotiation table, like with Ireland, like with Denmark, like after the constitution with France and the Netherlands. But it's not about the same thing. That was about the constitution. That was about a treaty. Here it's about in or out. It's the one or the other. And if I see how the currency of Britain is endangered, how now Britain is alienated from the US, and how Britain is step by step transformed in Little England, I think they're going to be wise and to stay in the European Union. But, dear colleagues, as pathetic this debate is for the UKIP, it's also a dramatic debate and an important debate for Europe. Because let's be honest, what we are discussing now is crazy. What we have to unite. We have not to be divided. The only ones who gain from a divided Europe are whom? People like Vladimir Putin, people like Bashar al-Assad, IS, and instead of discussing on how to stand up to them and develop a strategy, what we are showing for the moment is division. We are weak. And yesterday it became again very clear when the Russian-American plan for ceasefire in Syria happened, and we were again not around the table for such a crucial decision.
Continue to be eroded, and our security will continue to be at risk. We will continue to send billions more to the EU than we get back, and the fundamental flaws of membership will remain. But, Mr. President, even if we look at the mediocre tweaks being hailed by those advocating Remain, they bring with them no guarantees. There will be no guarantee of treaty change. This Parliament can unravel the deal, as can the ECJ. What we have before us is a charade, an attempt to deceive the British people with a pig in the poke deal. My message to my constituents is, don't buy it. Believe in our United Kingdom, because in the words of that wonderful Belfast-born author, there are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind.
Mrs. Dodds, you have 2 blue cards. Would you accept them? First is from Mrs. McGuinness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could I ask Mrs. Dodds if she would acknowledge the role of the European Union in the peace process in Northern Ireland, because it did create a space for those who were in disagreement, to put it mildly, to actually negotiate. And therefore, does she not see the value of the European Union in peace work generally, but in particular in Northern Ireland? And while we cannot interfere in the UK referendum, I, as a neighbour of yours on the island of Ireland, we do have to have a say, and our voices need to be heard, and I hope you'll accept that. Thank you.
Can I say thank you to Mrs McGuinness for her question. It is indeed a very relevant one, and I have always acknowledged the role that this place, this Parliament and these institutions have built or have made in making sure that there were peace funds available to Northern Ireland. However, Open Europe, for example, has estimated that in terms of structural funds, for every pound that Northern Ireland gets back, it costs us £1.58. In terms of good relationships with our neighbours in the Irish Republic, of course I welcome that today we have much better relationships than we have ever had before, and I hope and know that this will continue. And can I make a plea to Mrs McGuinness, to her Taoiseach and any future Prime Minister, that what we need in Northern Ireland is a genuine and honest debate, and not the scaremongering tactics that we have so far seen of those who threaten us with all kinds of things in Northern Ireland if we don't toe the European line.
Well, thank you very much. I will inform you that I am sticking to the precedent created by Mr. Schulz and accept only 1 blue card per speaker. So therefore I would ask for your indulgence with the rest who have asked for blue cards. Thank you very much. So now we move to Mr. Royal, 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Herr Präsident, Kommission.
President, Commission President, President of Council, in the last debate on the situation in Europe and the Council, I heard very strong criticism of the fact that in Council it was just selfish people putting their own interests first and squabbling. I think it's appropriate then to say that this last summit was one that proved things could go differently. I'm very satisfied and very happy that in the last summit the Council finally took decisions and demonstrated that the most difficult questions could be resolved. Thank you to Mr. Tusk, the President, and all those who worked on it. This is finally the proof of the pudding that Europe can act even on the most difficult questions. And I think Mrs. Harms made the point very rightly. Not only in the UK, the public is becoming aware about how significant and important the European project is and can become. If that serves us realising how important that project in Europe is in Council and Parliament, then we ought to be able to reach very difficult compromises on a number of issues. So I think this is a very valuable lesson and offers new opportunities for Europe. I do hope, particularly this is true on refugees. It's not the Chancellor alone who invited the refugees in. Much as I esteem you, Mr. Fox, it's a huge problem with lots of ramifications, and it can't be resolved on its own. The decisions last weekend can be the starting point for solving such big issues, and if we don't do that, we'll all experience a disaster.
Now I'm asking Mrs. Wilmot to take the floor for 3 minutes.
Colleagues, we could use this debate to discuss the details of the deal struck last Friday.